Good evening. I'm Malcolm Young, Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, California. Welcome to the Forum Winter Season. My guest tonight is Patricia Williams, one of the most important intellectuals in American law and a pioneer of both the law and literature and critical race theory movements in American legal theory. She is the University Distinguished Professor of Law and Humanities at Northeastern University and Director of Law, Technology, and Ethics Initiatives. Her award-winning column, Diary of a Mad Law Professor, appeared in the Nation magazine for 2 decades, and she is the recipient of 7 honorary doctorates and a MacArthur Fellowship. She is the author of 6 books, including The Alchemy of Race and Rights, which was named one of the feminist classics of the last 20 years that, quote, literally changed women's lives, end quote, by Ms. Magazine, and one of the 10 best nonfiction books of the decade by Amazon.com. Tonight, we mark the beginning of Black History Month with a conversation about Pat's most recent book, Giving a Damn, Racism, Romance, and Gone with the Wind, and how when you begin to unpick current debates about immigration, freedom of speech, the culture wars, and wall building, beneath them lies the unexamined history of enslavement in the West. Dr. Williams, thank you so much for joining us. We're delighted to have you. And what a pleasure after having all these decades of kind of being peripherally connected through our families' lives. And then certainly you've been a major feature in our reading and intellectual life at our household. I was looking back through Alchemy, and it's almost like doing an archaeological dig, because there's different layers of annotations that my wife made from different times she read it and different ones that I made. And one of the most embarrassing annotations in the book is one where you are talking about reconceptualizing from objective truth to rhetorical event. And you describe a conversation between 2 of your faculty colleagues and how one has this like other critic in mind who would criticize the argument in a particular way. And in the margins, my wife wrote my initials as maybe somebody who's guilty of doing the same kind of thing, being overly critical of someone's use of language and style. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your choices about style and how you address your audience, and how do you reach people? What are some of the questions that you have as you imagine your audience in writing your books?
Well, thank you for that very warm introduction. And it's such a pleasure to see you and your wife again. I mean, behind that introduction is the fact that we met 30 years ago. And it's such a delight to see you in this context. My focus on language is an effort at precision. Because I think that what I try to do is something that is an effort to deal with the fact that so much of the divisiveness of this moment, when about race, is about a concept that doesn't exist, but yet has such material consequence. So therefore, it is about something that is spoken into being or is written into being. And that arranges our concepts in ways that put blinders on our sense of possibility. And hence my emphasis on language, not just on arguing in without a sense of deep context. It seems to me that a lot of what divides us is a lack of context, a lack of particularity, as well as bad faith and mean-spiritedness. But so my audience, I think, is to people of goodwill who want to figure out how we invoke histories without a precise consciousness of what we're invoking. And that there's a kind of, what I think of as a kind of echo or echolalia embedded in historical events, that when you peel back the layers, well, where did that come and where did that come? Almost like maybe an historical thesaurus, working one's way back in time to the bare bones of what the social relations were that were embedded in law or embedded in particular social habits, or just embedded in particular turns of phrase and the etymology of particular words. So
Yeah. I pulled out my old copy of Martha Nussbaum's book, Love's Knowledge, today. And she writes, certain truths about human life can only be fittingly stated in the language of the narrative artist. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how literature is useful in illuminating issues having to do with race. We talked about Toni Morrison a little bit early, but when we were off camera before. But I wonder about how you as a literary artist and other literary artists help illuminate issues having to do with law and race.
I thank you for the appellation of literary or narrative artist. I like that. But when I think of Toni Morrison, I've been thinking a lot about the effort to ban books that has somehow resurged so tragically in this country and so forcefully and so suddenly. And one of the books most banned or removed from school libraries in the United States right now is Toni Morrison's book, Beloved. Even when Beloved first came out, I was always surprised that many of the reviewers talked about it like a ghost story, that it's a ghost story. But it's really so much more than that. It's so much richer. It is a history of trauma. I mean, it's a fictional narrative of a semi-dream world that is specifically about the effects of trauma. And if one, again, peels a layer beneath that, it is specifically the trauma that occurred in the life of a real person, Margaret Garner, and her trial. Margaret Garner was a slave who escaped from a plantation in Kentucky. She was owned by a man named Archibald Gaines. She had or been raped by him repeatedly and had 2 children, at least, I think, by him. And she escaped with those children, with 3 of her children, to Ohio. When the bounty hunters came to return her under the Fugitive Slave Act, and the Fugitive Slave Act allowed and sort of federalized the slave interests by allowing slave catchers to be provided with bounties to chase back the escaped property, the inventory of slave owners. And when they came to her door, she attempted to kill all 3 of her children rather than have them go back into bondage. And I think she successfully killed 1, but she was taken, and there was an attempted trial in Ohio. And the interesting part about that is that if she had been allowed to be tried for murder, she would have been recognized under the law of the free state of Ohio as a human being, as an agent, as somebody culpable. And under the laws of the South, of the slave states, she was in a very different status. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, she was escaped property. She was chattel. She was a thing. She was not fully human. And so there was a contest first, not of the trial of what happened to the dead baby, but her status of whether or not she would be tried. And the abolitionist lawyers were actually trying to have her tried for murder because that would acknowledge something in terms of the larger question of slave humanity. And but that did not happen, and she was returned. And she was described as being returned, almost boxed up and sent like a UPS package back to Kentucky and back to her owner. And so that history as being the nightmare and the echoing trauma that Toni Morrison writes about in that book is certainly why Toni Morrison certainly deserves the title of narrative artist, in terms of conveying the collective trauma, the echoing historical trauma, and the interior life that I think is so often unacknowledged of people who have endured torture and bondage, repeated rape, and it's an ultimate story of humanity struggling to claim its vivacity as human.
And to survive. I remember reading it as part of our seminary education. and just being so amazed by how powerful it was in conveying that experience. Your own work has been banned. Your own writing has been banned. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what that feels like, maybe first, and then maybe, if you were to meet somebody who was on a school board who was deciding whether or not to ban a work, or a library board, or, we talked a little bit about privatizing libraries before. If you could talk to somebody who was intent on banning books, what would you say to them?
It's, books about race is like talking about sex. It's, and now we're also not talking about sex or anything else, but it makes people squirrely and weird and squirmy. That said, it's a very different thing when the law intervenes and says you can't teach this. And when, as in Florida, books that parents have complained about are marked in very specific ways so they're inaccessible. And that, when that happens, I think we've entered a different world than simply, a teacher or even a school saying this is inappropriate for our kids. This brings us back to McCarthyism. But I think that it's actually what we're going through now is potentially worse than McCarthyism. Because the way in which SB 8 in Texas or the Stop Woke Act in Florida has enacted, teachers can't talk about it in their offices. Mm-hmm. In Florida, it also, and I'm not certain, there may be a case that has actually suspended the law for graduate public schools, but I know that part of the problem is in Florida is that you can't even talk about, critical race theory or what it deals with, which is part of it's part of constitutional law. You can't deal with race, even in your office. You can't talk with students about it anywhere. You can't talk about it in public libraries. And the way in which it's enforced is that you have this sort of distributed agency. You basically have the equivalent of vigilantes in the name of so-called parental freedom, that when a parent complains about it, then the book can be at least suspended, if not ultimately banned. And then a committee, which is appointed by the governor, who just doesn't want race talked about at all, who has decided that the AP class has the AP intervention, its entire curriculum is of, quote, no educational value. This incredible breadth is, it seems to me, even beyond what I think it's beyond anything we've seen in recent American history, perhaps going back to the Black Codes or Jim Crow, but really the Black Codes, where it was forbidden to allow African Americans or certain others to testify in court or to be heard. And it strikes me and many as an extension of the anti-literacy laws, which forbade not only African Americans to learn to read, but would punish anybody who taught slaves to read. And it seems that this is an extension in which anything that pertains to African American history can be pulled. And if you think I'm overstating, it's really interesting to look at PEN America, the writers' organization.
Right.
Its list of banned books. There are thousands of banned books. And for some of them, there can be no other reason except that it's about African Americans. Wynton Marsalis's book, which is, I think the title is like, it's like Shush, Bang, Boom, and it's about the sounds that a jazz orchestra makes. And it's for young children. Yeah. There is nothing, about politics. There's nothing about, I don't even, but yet it's been the books by Justice Sonia Sotomayor's children's book, written in Spanish for as which describes her own path to success, banned. So it's not just my books, which break my heart. It really does break my heart. But it's a kind of incomprehensible overcapaciousness in which what began as a discussion of specific history of laws, like anti-literacy laws,
Right.
among lawyers and law school educators, in seminars specifically addressing this, about the jurisprudence of, what we used to call integration, of becoming part of the polity, and the degree to which that has been bastardized. That's the only word I can think of, by a very mean-spirited, bad faith campaign. And so what I would tell people who are confused by this is, A, to read the books that have been banned. I mean, I've suggested, a banned bookmobile that would
I love that. Great.
Because some of them are really shockingly inoffensive by any measure.
Yeah.
And so that's one place to begin. But I also think it's really important to read the origin of this particular attack on critical race theory. 2 years ago, nobody knew what critical race theory was. It was not a popular anything.
Yeah.
It was, again, very limited. There were a series of books written under that rubric. There are, 10 to 12 people, including myself, listed on Wikipedia as associated with this conversation.
Yeah.
But President Trump issued an order saying that critical race theory is a poison and must be eradicated at all costs, and people should lay down their lives to eradicate it. This is terrifying. So that's, you asked my feelings. This is an invitation to the kinds of conspiracy craziness that has no relation to anything that I know of, or any of the, of what were originally critical race theories. It bears no relation to anything that we've written. I also think that what one should really read is the statement by Christopher Rufo, who was the muse for Donald Trump's statement, executive order now revoked, but nevertheless, Christopher Rufo is now on Ron DeSantis's team in an attempt to federalize the Stop Woke Act in Florida. And he specifically said, I wanted to take something and rebrand it. I wanted to make it something that would be associated with everything Americans fear. I wanted to make it associated with everything horrible in America, and then to sell that. So it is a very conscious act of propaganda to defame to other political ends. So I feel like those of us who were really genuinely earnest about the scholarship that began as the project of integration with the civil rights movement have been instrumentalized. We are sort of objects in this larger political war that has nothing to do with anything we've written. Yeah. So it's and it's very hard to respond in a coherent fashion because there's this double level. I can tell you what I think of as critical race theory, but the term has been so corrupted that it's impossible to talk to people without their thinking it's about child pornography, it's about grooming children, it's about hating it's about hating white people, it's about making white people hate themselves. And so I have written my entire career in an effort, I used to be mocked as Miss Kumbaya. It's like it was an effort to make the world a better place, and to see this work now being instrumentalized in a sort of gaseous cloud of fantasy Um, you know, how do you respond to something that has no coherent referent?
Yeah,
And so to go back to language,
you haven't.
This is a corruption of language itself.
It is. And you haven't read your books recently, but you're incredibly empathetic. I mean, one of my favorite sections is it's just like it's like a tiny little paragraph, but it's a side comment. And you're basically talking about the white flight from your neighborhood as a child. And you're sympathizing with how disruptive that must have been for the people whose racism undermined their sense of self and made them fearful and moved them to other places. It's really beautiful. I mean, so I can see how your friends and colleagues would describe you as the kumbaya lady, because it's so important, that empathy and love and concern for other people. It's exactly the opposite of what you describe as being caricatured by that propaganda movement. I've been thinking a lot about about Charles Lawrence's essay. He's got a recent essay called "The Fire This Time," which starts out with him going and doing his law school interview. So in the old days, Yale University, you'd have to go and interview with the dean of the law school. And one of the questions that the law school dean would ask is, well, what have you been reading lately? And so Charles Lawrence said, I've been reading James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. And the law professors, well, what did you think of it? And, instantly, Uncle Chuck is thinking, what do I say? And then the law dean is talking about, we have a Black friend who, and this is what the Black friend says. And I haven't read the book itself, but I've read the reviews in the New York Times. I mean, it was just all those classical things. And I think of critical legal theory as beginning in moments like that. And I wonder if you can talk about what the genesis of this important work is, and just kind of describe what the early days were like as you and other very powerful thinkers were beginning to struggle with the way that racism is so deeply embedded in law.
Yeah, and not just law, but I mean, it is the language. Classic moments like that. It is a mistaking of the singular for the plural, or the
Yes.
plural for the singular, and it is a misuse of the indicative. So, I think Roger Cohen wrote an article recently about a manual of style that some journalists use, and the manual cautioned against using the indicative, because it really does imply a sort of plural when you're talking about something which maybe is less than a plural. And so, I think immediately of people who talk about the Blacks, the Jews, that use of the, and is something which aggregates in a way, and aggregates a population that is much more varied than it ought to be. And so, an example of that might be, for example, the shooting in the tragic shooting in Monterey Bay, in which it's, the Asians. But, if you actually look at, it was a Chinese community which was attacked by a man whose name at least is Vietnamese.
Yes.
And the degree that the Asians become all one community may not take into account that there are other histories involved in the encounter. Again, please do not understand this is any kind of excuse, but the layering of the way in which different communities have different histories that come together in the United States. The Blacks in certain populations when I lived in New York, didn't really explain the kind of frictions between, for example, Dominicans and African-American descendants of slaves, or Puerto Ricans and Brazilians. But somehow everybody was Hispanic, which is a linguistic category, but doesn't account for all the little cultural nuance that might allow for interventions that would understand the frictions at a more nuanced level is all I'm saying. And so I think that those, and to go back to the Roger Cohen article, it became caught up in what strikes me as a very silly debate about the French, about whether the French, why is somebody making such a big deal about using the term the French? Well, partly because it's not usually marked in the destructive way that the Blacks or the Jews might be, but the idea that the indicative is used in a way that is relative to context, and that context may shift depending upon how you use that indicative, is really, it seems to me, an important part of the sophistication of how language can be used. And that when we dismiss it as simply silly, and that's certainly the way in which that, I think, there's been a big debate about whether or not this isn't another example of wokeism, to be conscious of the use of this kind of singularizing indicative. I think we miss opportunities to talk about that are the portals to the deeper sense of, really, maybe I'm thinking of everybody as one clump. It's easy enough. It's not, and if all we're doing is fighting about the fact that this can never be a serious argument, the level of dismissiveness, the refusal to take, to hear our conversations in this, to appreciate the habits of language that sometimes are minor, but sometimes might excavate something really interesting and reorganizing of our thought.
How did you find yourself just drawn to this area of scholarship? I mean, what was the beginning of your interest, and how did you have your ideas developed over time?
I think, this area of scholarship, I was actually good,
Well, you made it and you invented it.
I'm a contracts teacher. I began teaching contract law. But I also started writing outside of contract, I didn't really start in law. I started writing essays about my experience of being the first, always the first. I mean, how many times can one be a first? It was like, there were so few of us in law school, and not just African Americans. There were so few women when I was in law school.
Exactly.
These were conversations that came up out of necessity. When I was in law school, I think I was the last year, the first semester, we had what was called Ladies' Day, in which our professors would throw powder puffs out to the ladies in the class one day a month, and they would throw them what we call powder puff questions. And otherwise, women weren't called on. So, the conversation was started for us. Ruth Bader Ginsburg's famous experience with being invited to dinner because they were so few, and then told that they weren't going to be as productive as men because they were going to be reproductive. So I think our presence was always being questioned, and so one developed answers for that. I write everything that vexes me. Yeah. And so those became the first essays. And so I don't think that I came to it. It was brought to me when you're in elite circles and
circumstances forced them on you. Yeah, exactly.
No. The other part of it is that I grew up in a neighborhood that my mother had grown up, that my grandmother had grown up. But when I was small, white flight occurred. And so I think that essay to which you refer was when not just the parents, but the small children were ripped from their friends in the name of all of a sudden you have to be afraid.
Yes.
And I remember the daughter of my mother's best friend, that's how old, how long they'd been in the neighborhood. The daughter of my mother's best friend was my age. And suddenly she was talking about how she was afraid of colored people and she had to hold her breath around colored people. And I said, but I'm colored. She said, no, you're different. And so it really, and even at the age of 8 or 9, it was brought to me that there was something incredibly incoherent, but deeply powerful that there were two sides of the brain at work. Yes, I am your friend. You know me. I am your friend. We are best friends. We share our dolls. But at the same time, there's a category of me that you are so afraid of that you have to hold your breath around. And because, you're afraid it's like cooties. I think race, even among adults, operates like cooties. If you're around it and if you breathe it in, you'll be contaminated, but you're not exactly sure what the disease is. Cooties is always undefined. It's not nothing.
That's exactly what it is.
This thing that's under the skin that is, and so I think that, what's happening in this country is the pollination of a kind of fear that operates like cooties. And anger, it's like Christopher Rufo has urged people to assign all crime, all sex predation, and a nostalgia for a world before anybody talked about the difficulties of our history. And there is a nostalgia, is a fantasy of the past that never was.
Yeah.
And it's, this, I used to think I was being a little hyperbolic, but I'm reading a book by Victor Klemperer, who was a linguist. I believe he lived in Austria. He was Jewish. He was the conductor Otto Klemperer's brother. And he writes as a professor about the change that occurred during the years leading up to Hitler's takeover, but the anti-Semitism, the urging of leading up to the firing of professors in universities, the disdain of Jews have nothing to teach us. So they took all the books out of the library. But there was a moment at which suddenly all of that accumulated disdain and hatred, you have nothing to teach us, became, the kind of massive book burning. But it's worth reading the stages just before literally everything was taken off the shelves, because it is chillingly similar, I think, to what's happening now.
Well, and what you said in Giving a Damn, you describe Hitler's speeches too as being a way of someone may have more open-minded views. They may love their Jewish neighbor, but being in a stadium with thousands of other people chanting, it changes their reality. And as I was reading that in the book, I thought about Donald Trump's rallies and what effect they have, not just on people who are there, but anybody who's affected by them.
Yeah. There's a community in this kind of, in particular elements of Donald Trump's rhetoric, and in particular, and Hitler certainly was aware and maximized the propagandistic value of having large numbers of people coming together, chanting, almost hypnotized. And it bypasses a certain, the brain space of reason and proportion and certain kinds of logic, and it becomes it's more important to adhere, because that's where the pleasure center is touched.
Right. It's like it becomes about belonging and identity, and that's a terrifying thing. I remember the television that I watched as a child. I just remember it was a terribly racist, like everything on TV, things especially that were from the 50s and the 60s and that were rebroadcast. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your early memories of television and the media and their connection to race.
I grew up in an unusual family. My parents hated television, so we never got to watch television, actually. I grew up, we had a television, but we would be able to watch one program a week. And that was usually, I think we watched Ed Sullivan or something.
That's what I was going to ask. What was the show?
I grew up, I think we finally broke my parents down because the Beatles came to town and the Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan. And so we were permitted to watch Ed Sullivan every Saturday from there.
That's good. I'm glad that you prevailed.
Yeah, but I do remember that while we were not regular television watchers, my parents, recorded and talked about every new program that had a Black person anywhere in it, because you're right, there was a transformation at a certain point in time when there were no Blacks at all anywhere except Beulah, or the sort of Gone with the Wind stereotypes, tap dancers, or Bojangles, and Amos and Andy, but I think there were, ours was a family that sat down and my parents really talked about the significance of the integration of Woolworths, the integration of television, the history of why Bill Cosby's being on I Spy and being a law enforcement officer of sorts, or a spy, was so shocking, that he was in a position of power.
Right.
And so I do remember, Julia, a professional Black woman being depicted, the symbolic, the conversation of the tension of what television could produce in terms of symbolism and aspiration was a conversation that, I think continues to this day, that certainly, we had hoped had its loveliest flowering in the election of Barack Obama. And again, how I feel is just heartbroken that that kind of symbolism is being plowed under.
It is heartbreaking. In Alchemy, you write about your great-great-grandmother. And I wonder if you could talk about what it felt like when you first learned her story, or if you remember when it was that you first learned it, or if it was just part of your family culture and lore from the time before you were a child.
I think like many African Americans, and again, I have a longer sense of that history than many families, because my family were pack rats. So they kept everything: papers, curricula, notes. The moment they were released from slavery, they ran to the North, and those who didn't immediately were very influenced by Ida B. Wells. My grandmother went to the same college that Ida B. Wells did and could hardly wait to get out of Tennessee, which is where my mother's side of the family was from. And I knew very little about the generation before my great-grandmother. And like many African-American families, that was the generation that was raped. That was the generation of women. My great-great-grandmother, of whom I wrote, if there was any mention, people didn't talk about her. And I think I put in Alchemy that the only thing I knew about her was that she was considered lazy by my great aunts, and that she sat by the river all day and fished. And it wasn't until my sister actually went to the National Archives when she was working in DC and found what we think is the contract of sale of her. And she was purchased from Kentucky and taken to Tennessee by a man who was in his 30s. And the family lore, the rumor was that he had purchased her to practice on because he was going to be married soon. Mm. And he was going to be married to a widow in the neighborhood. And certainly in the census, this child whom he purchased at the age of 11, by the age of 12 and a half, had a child on the census, so that she had been impregnated very quickly. Yeah. And it was with that documentation, which was after both my sister and I were out of law school, so it must have been in my mid to late 20s that I discovered this document, that it hit me like a punch in the gut when I realized that even her descendants, even her daughters and granddaughters, remembered her as lazy, and what I think of now is clearly deeply depressed. Everything they say is that she didn't talk to people, that she was lazy and odd, and she must have been so depressed, purchased away from her family, impregnated, delivering a child, and then her children taken away to be house servants, because they were light-skinned and quote pretty, and that whole horrible history, which disguises family relation. It disguises, and that was the moment, and that's why I wrote that book, when I realized that this man, whom my family remembered as the master, was actually my great-great-grandfather.
Right.
And this vocabulary, redescribes, it uses the language of commodification, of master, of ownership, of control and agency, and the ability to buy and sell, that disguises, this is child abuse. This is, it's, and yet that was a systematized part of plantation life. She was inventory. She increased his wealth by her birth. And this was a habit of so many slave plantation owners that now I guess we're not supposed to talk about. But it seems to me that in order to heal it all, we need to realize that this was a system that destroyed Black and white, rich and poor, masters and the enslaved bodies, who became the object of whimsical desires and power to which they could not speak back. And this is not to make children feel badly.
Yeah. No, and I mean, it's still with us in every way. I mean, I think even our
for all of us. This is broken, really destructive family relationship for all of us.
Yeah. And you can think of, like the incarceration crisis in America, is directly connected to this. Even I think our ability to kind of write people who are living on the streets off, our massive differences in income inequality, homelessness. It's all about kind of being able to shut off that part of us that treats other people as human beings. And for centuries, the country was built on the effort to try to do that, to switch off another person's humanity. You were talking about just how you're not doing it to to change children's perspectives or anything. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just moments in your presentations, like when people have responded in a kind of adverse way, like what makes people angry about your message? Because to me, it's a message of love, a message of the possibility of reconciliation and healing. So what makes people mad about things that you say?
Well, one thing you said, I just wanted to take issue with it. You said that I'm not trying to change children's perspectives. I do want to change everybody's perspective.
I do too.
That's what makes people mad.
Yeah.
I
guess what it was Plato accused of, like, perverting the children. That you mentioned that as being kind of like your crime also.
Yeah. But I want them, I want people, human beings, to, and I think the only way you can do that is to grow up together, is to know each other. The beginning of my little friend, who moved away, there was a part of her who just saw me as a human being because we had grown up since birth together. Yeah. And that is the perception that one wants all of us to have, that we grow up in a culture where we look different, we come from different cultures, but we exchange and talk about our difference, and we learn to love one another, or we learn to be accustomed to one another. And if we don't like each other, we leave each other alone, or that we move through the world without a sense of what I and that's what I don't want to convey, is that collectively a category, whether it be Black, white, young, old, is responsible for for history. we are the products of history, and we're responsible for making life better from here on out. And that's and we can only do that by knowing, by seeing the trail of history, by understanding how recursive this feeling is. I mean, I remember I was in Britain, and I got an award in Britain, and there was and actually it was on Martin Luther King Day, as celebrated in Britain, and one of the bishops there actually came and apologized to me on behalf of all white people. I said, I am so moved by the gesture, but it's so not what I think this effort is about. And I've got to say, I'm not about to apologize on behalf of all Black people. And again, I think it's that way, this habitual way in which, when we're not accustomed to speaking across these imagined boundaries, that we inappropriately speak or mistake the plural for the singular and the singular for the plural, or we mistake, the whole range of white people for specific events in our collective shared history. If you want to apologize to me for, the acts of, the Church of England, for example, that's something that might lead to a more nuanced description of a particular event that isn't about your behavior or my behavior, but it's an historical phenomenon that we can discuss together, as in terms of how each of us are the inheritors of that. But it is absolutely not what I think anybody in legal academia, anybody who is sincerely seeking a kind of civil rights recuperation, remediation, collective reconciliation is seeking.
Yeah. We're talking a lot about reparations in San Francisco. I wonder if you have any, thoughts about reparations and just kind of how do you perceive that?
I think that, to the extent, reparations is such a vexed word to lawyers.
Yeah.
And so I think that I understand the reparations movement as a movement for repair.
Yeah.
But in terms of the way in which law is constructed, reparations is usually an action related somehow to tort, which usually involves a specific history with a specific victim, where some of the victims are still alive, and you repay some amount either in punitive damages or for the loss of real estate. I think the most successful reparations actions in the United States are for people who were cheated out of housing or couldn't get into housing, and you can actually track the policies and the relation to specific losses. And so I tend to think of reparations in a broader sense than just what the law would like repairing things that were stolen by Nazis during against Jews who are still alive or their descendants who can be identified. Slavery was just, it's, and so that's why I believe that affirmative action is a form of reparations, and it's a repair that extends generationally across the board, and it really addresses the real harm, which is how we perceive African Americans, how we perceive color in this country. And it seems to me, how we immediately impute racial hierarchy. And that's something which is so much more diffuse, but it's the core of what's so horrible about the divisions in this country, that it's attitudinal, and it's a sensorium of repulsion and aversion, like my little friend who wanted to hold her breath.
Yes.
And the repair for that, it seems to me, is that you have to be in each other's presence until that wears off or wears down, or you suddenly hear the other human being as a human being. I remember when I was studying psychology in college, and it was in the context of pregnancy in the 1950s, that pregnant women were supposed to hide themselves. Prior to that in our history, we've forgotten this, and so they did a psychological experiment of a pregnant woman coming on an elevator in a business office, and people would stare and they'd stare and they couldn't take their eyes off the baby bun. I mean, it was a very different time than now.
It is.
And, but they actually, they took data about how long it took for people to get used to the fact of pregnant woman in their midst, and then their eyes would slowly meet their, they would move upwards, and they would encounter a human being. They would say, okay, I've gotten over my panic, I've gotten over the fact that this is so unusual, and now I can look in your eyes. And we're so, I mean, that seems maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but it does seem to me that that's what needs to happen on a massive scale. And that's why I'm still a deep believer in affirmative action, that as a way of accustoming ourselves in a country where we're the most diverse country on the planet, particularly in terms of people coming from different cultures and encountering each other de novo. And that's such a rich resource of human understanding potentially, but yet we have a country in which most white people have no Black friends or no Black neighbors, or if they have one, they keep proffering them. I have a Black friend, and my Black friend, and that becomes generalized as the Black gospel. and that seems to me, again, testament to how much we do not know each other.
I've benefited tremendously from affirmative action, and just because the University of California at Berkeley, so by state mandate, it was abolished by the regents, and the experience of people who followed after me was impoverished because of the abolition of those affirmative action programs. So I agree with you. Our greatest strength is how different we are, and the only way we can realize that strength is actually if we are mixed with one another, if we can know one another, if we can learn our stories.
Our greatest gift is also how much the same we are.
Exactly.
And yeah.
In your, I think it's Alchemy, you mentioned about your family's role in establishing Black Episcopal churches. And I wonder if you talk about, I know, I loved that. We had,
I lived in San Francisco some years ago and went to Grace Cathedral well before Jane Shaw. Also a mutual friend of mine.
Angela Davis was here and preached 2 months ago and talked about just the importance of the Episcopal Church in her family's life. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about your own faith or what you see as the church's strengths in helping to bring about the society where we do begin to get to know each other.
I really, I was raised in the Episcopal Church, 2 generations ago, just out of slavery. There was this somewhat complicated relationship to the white family that had owned, so-called, my mother's people. But the white woman who was the mistress of the house, and one can see this in other histories. There are lots of histories that this is happening throughout. That in order to really lower the temptation of white husbands for Black women, there was a real push in some communities, households, plantations, to bring religion after slavery, after the ban against after anti-literacy governance, to bring religion to Black populations, and the Episcopal Church was part of that, and that's what my family. They began an Episcopal church in Tennessee, very close, and it was obviously part of Jim Crow. It was a Black Episcopal church. I was raised in Boston. My family came from the South, moved to Boston, and were very involved in the Episcopal Church for all the time we have been in Boston. I am somewhat lapsed, but but the thing I love about the Episcopal service, and I was reading something in the paper about sort of the new religious nationalism that's in that is in the United States, is that there is no more prayer for peace in some parts of the country, or in some churches, some evangelical, and I don't mean to, it may not be evangelical, but some more of the sort of conservative movements that believe that, in holy warriors. And so, what I recall growing up with was a church that prayed for peace, that prayed for politicians in a very different way than I see being the kind of noisy religious rhetoric that seems to have meshed with a certain component of our political lives. And that saddens me. But it is why I've always loved Grace. It's why I love the Episcopal Church when I go. It's not as regularly as I should. Here in Boston, and what it stands for.
Yeah, Charles Lawrence's father was the first African-American president of the House of Deputies. So he's like, I don't know, like the Speaker of the House version of the Episcopal Church. It's such a prominent family too. His sisters, as you probably know.
And I used to go to St. John the Divine when I was in New York.
I love it there. Two great places. You have in all the notes that they gave me to prepare for our meeting today, they told me that you're working on so many different projects. One is the Talking Helix, another is Gathering the Ghosts, and another is on a documentary on killing unarmed citizens like Trayvon Martin. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about any of those projects or some things that you're working on that excite you these days.
Yeah. I mean, I did do a piece which, it evokes my sadness to think about. I did a piece called Skittles as Metaphor, and I think that's the title of it. It was actually a journal piece. It's in a journal called Theory and Event from Johns Hopkins University, and it was about the litany, the repeated. It is almost like our national chorus, our Greek chorus of mourning. He reached for his gun. I was in fear for my life. It's the thing that Tyree Nichols's officers in that tape, hear them recuperating. Well, what really happened? Oh, he reached for my gun. This is the Rodney King, the same thing that's happened over and over and over again. And whether it's a learned litany or whether it's a repeated litany, it is a litany of tragedy, and very interrelated with the thinking that's behind the proliferation of stand your ground laws, which so disproportionately license the killing of minorities or people who are not perceived to have ground to stand on. And the thing about stand your ground laws is that they really make public sidewalks, public streets, a kind of privatized ground, and then say, if somebody threatens you in that space which you've declared your ground, then it is your subjective fear, not a normative fear, not a reasonable fear, but your subjective fear that allows you to protect yourself. And that means we're really back to the days of cowboy justice or vigilante justice. And so that's what that piece was about, the reiteration of all these killings that supplant public safety with private notions of, I shoot first and ask questions later. That's an ethic that seems to have replaced a presumption of innocence.
Yes.
And I appreciate fear, I appreciate danger, but all of that, stand your ground laws do not replace gun control. And the fact that so much of why we are afraid in walking down the street has to do with, automatic weapons and more guns than people. So that's one. The other thing that I'm really concerned about is the reinstantiation of certain kinds of what Ruha Benjamin has titled, the new Jim Code, that that our data is being picked up and aggregated and in ways that we can't speak back to because it's largely in black boxes or proprietary. And so algorithmic assortments are something that arrange our lives, give us feeds, inform us in very particular ways that are reinforcing of previous actions rather than allowing us to explore without this sense of being guided down a particular runnel of where we have been before and things like that. And so I think there's a kind of what some in media studies have called homophily of, you get what you already like, and then it becomes tighter and tighter and tighter in terms of your system of reference, and you become less exposed to the entire creative universe of human thinking, and all you see is the same thing. And this I think has resulted in something like cultic thinking or superstition, if all you're seeing is a reinforcement of even the silliest notions that crossed your mind, then you end up with things like QAnon. And so I think that we're living through a technological revolution, and it's ungoverned and to some extent ungovernable because it is owned by private companies that do not have public interest necessarily at their center. It's for profit. And that's going to be a problem that we definitely have to, whose consequences we're already.
I had so many questions I wanted to ask you about technology, and we talked a little bit about part of the problem with the Florida and the banning books is just doing it on such a massive scale. I often talk about the treatment of witches. Like after the invention of the printing press, it wasn't this tiny local phenomena; it was like a global phenomenon. And so the book banning is employing these new technologies too.
Yeah, and facial recognition, for example. You may have heard about the owner of Madison Square Garden.
Yes, I have.
For something or other. But
lawyers, yeah.
Yeah, and so he's barred any of the lawyers in that firm. And so this woman got a birthday gift to go to the Knicks game, and she's a member of that firm, not necessarily on this team, but facial recognition barred her at the gate. And it's that kind of privatized exclusion that vitiates the civil rights notion of public accommodation, regardless of race. It seems to me that we are if race is a kind of genre at heart, it's not just about color. We could reinscribe it to be about all lawyers from this firm,
right, completely
not welcome, and it may as well be, a separate water fountain for them. And
yes.
And the technology makes these new forms of constriction, restriction, less than public accommodation, steering and hiring, not only a palpable consequence, but very hard to trace and to identify if you don't even know what's happening.
Yeah. I'm so disappointed, Professor Williams, that our time is out. I had so many more questions. I just asked you like 20% of the questions that occurred to me. Your work has meant so much to me and to Heidi, and we're so grateful for what you're doing. And I know you're really on the front lines, and I know that you've received a lot of terrible attention from the far right. But I want to just thank you for what you're doing to build, what churches call the kingdom of God, the realm of God. But that ideal of us being to be able to really see each other for who we are and really encounter each other. So thank you very much for your ministry to all of us through your work.
Malcolm, it is such a delight to see you. It's such a delight to have reconnected with Heidi. And as lapsed as I am, the one thing I do retain from my religious upbringing is a sense of faith. And it has been such a gift to me to be able to speak with you tonight. It's been a pure joy. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thank you. And for everyone else, please join us on Sunday. We're going to be in person for the forum at 9:30 a.m. when my guest will be the St. Augustine scholar Margaret Miles. She was the first tenured faculty member at Harvard Divinity School as a woman. She'll be talking about some exciting new findings she's discovered while writing what may be her last book. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. You can give online at gracecathedral.org or by texting THINK, THINK, to 76278. And thank you again to Professor Pat Williams. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll look forward to next time our paths cross.
My pleasure. Take care. Lovely to see you.
Yes.